Welcome to the TR2050 series of global panel discussions on the future of reward. My name is Ben Shenoy and I'm a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. In this series, we'll be discussing how the world of reward is going to unfold over the decades to come. This topic is central to TR2050, Total Rewards 2050. This series will take place across 4 dynamic cities: London, Dubai, Stockholm and Boston. In each city, we'll convene a group of thought leaders to delve into how the evolving landscape of work will affect how reward professionals can adapt. We'll explore major shifts from the rise of the gig economy to how technology might change the rewards. We begin this series in London and we're here in the venue of the RSA, which is the Royal Society of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. It is my pleasure to welcome to our panel today Ashok Pillai. Ashok is the Senior Vice President of Reward and Wellbeing at BP. Kathrin Kahrass. Kathrin is the Group Senior Vice President and Global Head of Reward at the Adecco Group. Peter Newhouse, who's a Global Reward Advisor. Dominic Cole-Morgan. Dominic is the Group Reward Director at WPP. And finally, Michael Piker, Global HR Exec and someone who also lectures on the topic of reward. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's start by looking at personalization in reward. While personalized pay can offer benefits such as motivation and retention, organizations must consider potential drawbacks and risks such as bias, inequity, and effects on team dynamics. We have to balance individual recognition with collective goals. And this is key to fostering a positive and productive work environment. So what I'd like to learn from our panel is how have enterprises responded to the growing desire for personalization? And how do they address the issues to do with fairness? So Peter, if I ask you to start the discussion off.
Well, Ben, I think there's 2 big problems with personalisation, which is a great idea. First problem is that most employees don't really want to make a choice. And the second problem is that we don't really want to give them one either. And I think before we get on to the employees, let's talk about our reticence. And I think really the enemy of choice is complication. And so the problem is that reward is already pretty complex. And if we give people choice, it becomes even more complex. And at that stage, we get all these ideas about fairness and problems. So I think the first thing we've got to do is to simplify pay. Once we've simplified it, I think choice becomes a different problem altogether. So how do we simplify it? Not that difficult. You take all the variable elements, you discount them for uncertainty, and you add them all to the fixed elements, and you've got one number for pay. That means you can array pay from top to bottom, and you can compare people very easily. And after you've done that, then you might want to give people a choice. And of course, the choice set is not complete until it includes not having to make a choice. So there ought to be some kind of a default setting that says, we generally think that this is the right composition for the elements of pay. If you want to change it, you're welcome to. So I think behind all of this is the idea of interaction between the company and the employee. And that's the piece that's missing. It's not that we're missing out on giving people a choice. What we're really missing out on is asking people what they want. And as a profession, we have a fear of asking people what they want because we don't know what to do with the feedback. Now, if we were a little braver about that, a little bit more courageous, we could get some really good feedback, and then the default position could follow the demographics. We don't have to give people a choice. We could just make pay a little bit more useful for people if we understood the demographics and got some feedback from people about what they wanted. Last point, why don't people want to make a choice? I think a lot of it is a kind of fear of complication, but also fear of consequences. If I have hyper-personalization where I can choose more incentives or less incentives, that's great until the incentives mature and then I've either lost out or I've gained. And if I look at you as being somebody who might have gained and I lost, I'm not going to blame myself for that choice. I'm going to blame the organisation.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Some really interesting, fascinating points you raised about complexity, complication, both on the, if I might say, the supply side, the reward system, and also the demand side for employees, and an interaction here between complexity and psychology.
And I heard you were quite interested in complexity.
Yes, which is why I picked up on it. So thank you very much, Peter. That was great. Ashok, what are your thoughts on this question?
I tend to look at personalization from two perspectives. There is, what are you trying to personalize? And the second for me is how you personalize it. You just take a step back on what. The classic package is a salary, bonus, equity, and then you've got benefits. And if we all step back in time, the first degree of personalization happened with flexible benefits. Remember those times. But I think after the pandemic, what we found is there's been a bit of a seismic shift. There's a lot of focus now on work-lifestyle balance, and it's about employee well-being. And that opens out a huge area of what choice you can give, because each one of us is different. Some of us need to look at physical well-being, what that looks like. And I think you spoke about the concept of fairness. So a lot of companies today will look at what would physical well-being look like? How do you have global minimum standards across the world and create that fairness inside organizations? So there's something about physical well-being. There's something about mental health. And just the sheer recognition of that fact is something that's important. And of course, there's social and financial well-being. But these are all choice points. And each of us choose and adopt things differently. But that's an area of choice you give. It's almost risk-free of how you can have people make choices around it. So there's one big bucket of what for me. The other issue I look at is how. And there's a bit what Peter said, which resonates with me. Choice is really appealing, but it's also debilitating, right? Because a great example is DC pension plans. And you look at the investment choices you give people, it's confusing. And perhaps what we're doing is it sort of weakens investment preferences because people don't know what to do. So the way I look at this, and there's a bit of a clue in this for me, the way I tend to look at this is, let's not go in for mass customization, but let's have measured choices that people can take from depending on your persona. So on the one side, you can say, I'm a low risk individual. My risk preference is low. Give them a choice model that they can take from that. Someone else at the other end of the spectrum saying, I value high risk, and create something for them in that space. It's easier to digest rather than give a complete plethora of choice and personalization. Instead, sort of create personas is what I'm saying, and then people can choose which persona sort of resonates with them. So that's how I see this dimension.
Great. Thank you, Ashok. I want to pull out a couple of points. Thank you for building on what Pete said. So we're, a few years after the pandemic, and you're seeing some major shifts in the practice reward as a result of that, around a different set of preferences, people are around well-being, flexibility. You're building on what Peter said about the complexity of choice, and also Peter's point about, I'm going to introduce a psychological phrase, the paradox of choice, this illusion of choice. We think we want choice, and we're scared by it. So the more choice you give me, the less I actually want to choose. Right, so thank you for please, Ashok.
It's an exciting space for us as reward professionals.
Yes.
If you really think about it, if it's an employee, how much time are they really sitting down and spending throughout the year thinking, let me make some choice about my pay? It's not, right? So you have to be just practical about how you frame it for them.
So simplify it.
Yeah.
Real trade-off here,
Yeah,
or a
absolutely.
real balance to be struck between simplification and attractiveness. Okay, great. Thank you, Ashok. Dominic.
I think Peter explained perfectly adequately why, as reward professionals, we've struggled with this topic. I mean, everyone's talked about this, can we take the compensation, turn it into points, and let people allocate, and no one's really done it. I was actually Googling earlier, and I couldn't find a company that had come out and said doing it. And I think there's a couple of things and I don't want to repeat everything I've said, which we also need to realise, what are we going to lose by that choice? Because actually we have incentive plans for a reason. We've been building them all our lives. We have a view that they actually are important, that bonus plans communicate something about what the organisation is going to reward. They're communicating maybe parts of the culture. So we'll lose that if we move to some sort of like customization. Somebody will go, I don't care about hitting that target now because I'm gone fully fixed. So I think we need to work that out. It's not going to work for every population as well. I mean, investors are never going to get their head around this in the senior population. Imagine ISS voting for a plan that was all fixed.
Yes.
It's not going to work. So we probably need to compartmentalise the populations. And when you get down to junior ones where we're saying to them, do you want bonus, do you want base? Actually, we should have the question, should we just get rid of bonuses for junior people? I honestly wonder, and it's a topic we can maybe discuss, how useful bonuses are for very junior employees. How much time do you expect managers to be tracking performance and this differentiation of pay, and it's a few dollars here and a few dollars there, and employees getting a very bad, feeling that they're receiving a very bad message, and then the impact on their engagement. So I think actually customization and personalization is here to stay. But actually we should think about where do we do it, what populations, and where might it just be a case of simplification is the right route. Get rid of bonuses, get rid of profit share, just pay them on a base salary for most junior people. And for the senior people where there's a really important message you need to send through share plans, total shareholder return, or incentivization and the targets you set, then absolutely you probably need to be saying, yeah, most of yours is variable, you're not going to get a choice. So it's probably a population in the middle this might work for, not the top and not the bottom. So
really interesting, building again on what Peter and Ashok have said, what you seem to be saying is be more discriminating about how you use this tool. This, hearing a lot of noise about this, but be thoughtful about it, and perhaps with the junior staff, actually what's the marginal value of this?
Yeah. We put managers and employees through this huge process, and sort of the variance is minute at times.
Yeah.
And the messaging is always difficult. That's the problem.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dominic. Kathrin, what would you like to add to the discussion?
Maybe just to pick up on the point that Dominic just made on being discriminating about it, because as I was thinking about it, for me, I think the personalization, it's clearly here, it's clearly in the conversation, it's been in the conversation for a while, and it will stay. I don't think it's existential for employees, for companies to provide that necessarily, but I think those that do will differentiate themselves in a positive way, for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think as we talk about this, I think for me, one of the things that we haven't talked about is about the context. I do think the context, the organizational context matters hugely, because there are all these ideas and desires and priorities, but then it comes back into the context of what is the reward structure and the maturity of a company in their structures, what is the level of digitization, the level of infrastructure that exists. Because simplification, I think, to be simple is the most difficult thing. I think everyone aspires it to be, and I've worked for a number of companies. I've not worked anywhere where that's been perfected, and there have been lots of degrees of simplification. So I think for me, it's one of the things, whether or not it's the right thing to do, depends a little bit on the ROI that you get out of it, when you contrast it with other things that you also have to do. And for me, I think doing the basics brilliantly is probably more valuable to employees, and by the basics, that's pay equity, it's pay transparency. I think we wouldn't be fretting about the European Pay Transparency Directive if we had it all figured out already. So I think there's things that we need to do still. I think a lot of companies do need to do them, that probably ultimately might be more beneficial, because fairness and the whole perception of fairness, it comes back to trust. And I think trust comes with transparency, it comes with clarity, it comes with understanding. And I think we have still a lot to do to build that transparency and clarity in a lot of cases. And for me, I think for personalization to be truly the environment in which it can thrive, I would say, is where I think you do the basics brilliantly and it's understood and people buy into it. Then I think it can be super successful and powerful. Otherwise, I think it has potentially the risk of a bit putting lipstick on a pig, because there's other stuff that is much more fundamental and foundational that is not working yet.
Thank you, Kathrin. Again, what's fascinating about what you said, back to this idea of simplification isn't simple, right? It's very attractive. We all search for it. And from your experience, I'm guessing, not easy. The Holy Grail is not easy to find. The second thing that comes out from what you said, again, echoes of what Ashok said about equity, fairness, well-being. it's quite interesting that you're saying those are hygiene factors.
They are.
Fix those first before you do this fancy stuff.
They are table stakes, but I think
Yeah.
we're still all struggling with the table
Yeah,
stakes.
okay, so that's really interesting. Great. Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I guess I'm drawing upon my consulting and corporate life, which was different, applying it in-house versus actually selling it to clients. So I look probably at two dualities. There's personalization and there's hyper-personalization. And it's important to distinguish that, building on my colleagues' aforementioned points. So if you look at personalized, it could be persona-driven, i.e. what Ashok has postulated. And you have sort of guardrails on which you can consider risk tolerance, lifestyle change, monetization, the value that you confer, could be within set boundaries. The conundrum I've faced, probably like my colleagues, is contextually, as you rightly said, hyper-personalization, and Peter and I have talked about UFlex and other platforms. How do you get to looking at, for example, pecan data and engagement data that then transposes what employees want to really true hyper-personalization? And that's what I call the golden nugget. And I've tried to solve it over 35 years around the world, and I haven't solved it yet. And it's a real conundrum, is how do you go from like a DC plan to, okay, so split pay and I've got variables and currency and context. How do I actually deliver a true hyper-personalized reward experience as a recipient as opposed to preferring it? And I can see it in aspects of salary and bulking up your salary, removing your incentives, as you rightly said. But then how do you demonetize and depostulate benefits and crank that into the salary?
Yep.
I struggle with that. So the intent and the pecan data tells me engagement-wise, yeah, absolutely interested, totally interested in this. The application and the practicality is so hard.
Putting a monetary value on these things.
Yeah, and then you look at a multi-global context
Yeah.
in Japan, which is risk tolerant, which I'm about to move there. It's completely different than Europe versus the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these are, I think, at least for me, what I've grappled
In
with. And I haven't
global
solved it.
companies. Yeah.
It's a conundrum.
Great. Thank you. Really interesting points all of you raised. Anyone want to add anything to what you've heard from your colleagues?
I think it's a really big debate, because if you really believe in diversity and inclusion, you really want to do hyper-personalisation, because it's what makes the package meaningful to the individual and therefore is better glue, more engaging.
Yeah.
However, there clearly are problems, as Mike says, with delivery and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure if we've got ourselves confused by whether it's really necessary. You know, I think the point, as I made before, is not that you have to do this, but you have to listen. And I think that's the one thing that we're really not good at as a profession, is listening to the voice of the employee. I think the problem is that we're still giving people what we think they should enjoy and not even asking for any feedback. And their job is to accept it, put up with it, and we're running a kind of monopoly. And so we don't even have the feedback to improve our own quality standards. And I think it's only when you ask for feedback that you actually have to improve the quality of what you're offering to people. We don't do that. And I think that's a big drawback to our approach.
Really interesting. I'm going to do a sales pitch for TR2050 now. One of the things we're working on is what are the assumptions upon which our reward systems are based? And of course, what the next step is then to say, where might they not be true? And then, of course, what do you do about it? So it's quite interesting. I've been listening to experts on reward, because I'm not one, and fascinating to hear you discuss over the time I've been working with TR2050 on the assumptions and how steady they've been over quite a long period of time, right? And how maybe we need to adapt them. So great, thank you for that. Anyone want to add anything else?
I think there's something about, to your point, Peter, about the voice of the consumer, which is the employee, is about sort of holding their hands and stepping through this process of what does making a choice look and feel like, and how do you do it? And so maybe we have to start taking the smaller steps of getting people used to how this works before we think about let's just do mass customization and hyper personalization.
Yes.
Because then they're lost. They just don't know where to start. And I totally agree with Peter saying that it is all well and good to make choices as long as I'm not losing. It's when I start losing personally, it's the organization's problem. And how do you get away from that and in some ways make individuals take responsibility for that, and for that you take small steps. You can't just go straight to let's do hyper-personalization.
Really interesting point you raised, Ashok, and echoes what Kathrin said earlier about the hygiene factors. Daniel Kahneman died in the last week or so, Nobel Prize winner.
Exactly.
And he was one of the psychologists who quantified risk aversion.
Yeah.
And this idea, of course, one of our assumptions is I incentivize you with a bonus. Mm-hmm. The other thing, of course, you're pointing at, Ashok, is I incentivize you, or I incentivize myself by avoiding loss, which is what you, as a driver of behavior, it's a very powerful driver of behavior. So you're raising a really interesting point, which potentially tests some of our assumptions.
And Ben, you'd know the answer to this, but I believe that people value losses more highly than gains. So if I lose something, it's more impactful if I gain the equivalent.
Absolutely. So roughly, you value the pain you experience from losing $1 is roughly twice the pleasure you experience from gaining $1. So it's 2 to 1, roughly. 2 to 1. So this is a strong driver of behavior.
Yeah. So and the pain lasts longer than the pleasure.
Yes, probably. Yeah.
Organization too.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Anything? Great discussion, by the way. Anything else to add?
Dominic, just on that sort of, and I think what we have done well as an industry, or better than to the customization of the cash elements, is the customization of things like benefits and terms. A lot of companies are moving away from a one size fits all to a diversity view of actually let's do something which is going to be supportive of people who are trying to have babies, or the trans community, or another equity deserving group. And I think that we've thrown away the truism of everything has to be equal for everybody to one of equity, and I think we should
not lose that.
We should reflect actually we have done some personalisation and customisation for populations that is beneficial and has been well received by our employees. We just haven't managed to do any of the cash elements yet.
Yeah.